myself, it was only recently that I discovered the whole Hippo idea of G6 and B6, and I must say I quite like the flexibility. It's very complementary with G6, and I think there are certain times when it definitely deserves to be played. So let's take a look at a training game I had with one of my students. This was actually a blindfold game. That is, I was blindfolded on a trip from New York down to Florida. This was in early 2011. Knight c3, d6. Now again, we could play c6 and on f4 play d5 and head to the Grandmaster system. In this case, I played d6. I wanted to try the Hippo. White played knight f3. This is not overwhelmingly threatening. f4 would be more challenging. There, if we wanted to continue in Hippo fashion, we could play a6 and on knight f3, b5, bishop e3, bishop b7, and this is very, very sharp play. After knight f3, I played a6, and on bishop c4, I probably should still continue b5, and if bishop d5, no big deal, just play c6. And then, after bishop back, I might even consider e5, or even knight d7. The old bishop check, king takes, knight check, king back, knight in. Notice that I have squares for my queen. Therefore, pick one, say b6, and on knight g7 check, king up, we trap the knight. Therefore, if I am able to play knight d7, the next move would be e5 or knight to b6. And this c6, b5, and a6 is very useful to have for black in the modern defense in this system. Going back though, after bishop c4, I played e6 just to keep the bishop out of d5. White played bishop g5, attacking my queen. I interposed my knight. Now white played a4. According to Roman, this is always a good idea if black plays a6 to play a4. I now play knight d7, and after queen d2, he's lined up the battery, queen plus bishop, threatening to play bishop h6. I didn't appreciate the danger, and I blithely went about setting up my Hippo. In retrospect, I should play h6 right away. So, again, this is not a perfect game, but there's some very instructive points. In this situation, I should not let white play bishop h6 and exchange bishops. I think I was concerned that after bishop to e3, I wouldn't be able to castle. However, we'll see as play developed, I later played g5 and knight g6. That would have been the same plan here. Going back to the game, after queen d2, I played b6. Once white castled, then I went ahead and played h6, because I did not want to allow bishop h6, taking the latent life out of the position for black. So now after bishop e3, bishop to b7, and we can see the point of the Hippo. White has to fight against both fianchettoed bishops. After rook at f to e1, now black is congested, so what is his plan for getting the pieces into action? I hit upon the plan of g5, all the more tempting since the white king is over here. My plan is simple. I want to play knight over, possibly queen e7, and then I will decide which way I want to go as events develop. White became so worried about the advanced g4, which is not really on the menu for a while, played the very surprising g4. Now this does prevent g4 by me, however, it also voluntarily removes pawn cover from the white king. Probably after g5, a more serious challenge to black's setup would be h4, and on g4, knight h2, attacking the pawn on g4, and on h5, knight back to f1, with a view towards playing knight g3, bishop g5, and seeing what black plans to do. After g5 though, g4, I continue on my merry way, knight to g6, and now we can see I'm gradually taking a grip on the dark squares. Now surprisingly enough, Fritz actually considers this to be slightly better for white, but again, positions that are non-tactical are not Fritz's forte. I already considered that black had equality because I didn't really see how white was going to get an advantage with either advance. E5 is not possible because the knight on f3 is hanging, and d5, I can lock it up and my knight is ready to occupy f4. Or on d5, I can even take on c3 and then lock it up. White now should play h3 and protect the advanced g-pawn. Instead, rook b1. I now played knight f6, immediately hitting both pawns. White should now play d5 and go in for complications. Then it's up to black whether I want to take on g4, whether I want to push by, which is probably quite okay. In the game, white played h3. I now lop off a very valuable center pawn. After knight e4, bishop e4, even gaining a tempo on the knight on f3. White played queen e2, lined up a battery on my a6 pawn. Note that after bishop e4, if white tries to recoup his pawn with bishop takes g5, discovered attack on my queen, discovered attack on my bishop. I then play hg5, and rook e4 is very adequately met with d5, forking the two pieces. Note also that after bishop g5, hg5, knight g5, I simply play bishop h6, pinning the knight. After queen e2, bishop g5, queen takes e4. White hopes to create some noise with bishop takes e6, but the powerful knight f4 does the trick. Protects e6, supports the d5 advance, and overpowers the h3 pawn. Going back to the game, after I took the pawn on e4, queen e2, I simply retreated the bishop. On bishop d2, queen f6, double attack on the knight. White now should play d5, taking advantage of the pin along the e-file. And this would also allow him to block the diagonal for my bishop. After castles, queen d3, and white is a clear pawn down, but hunkering down. I would probably continue with knight f4, or maybe rook at f to e8. In the game, white continued with knight h2, and after castles, rook a1, I simply took off a second pawn. Now, of course, from a material advantage, the position's overwhelmingly winning, so we will just go through very quickly to show you the rest of the game. c3, queen back to f6, two extra pawns, bishop d3, and now knight f4, hitting d3, e2, and h3. After queen e3, I could play knight g2 winning the exchange, but instead I liked my knight where it was and I wanted to start advancing my center pawns. After queen g3, I decide I'd better go ahead and take this bishop, takes, and rook at a to d8. After b3, rook fe8, c4, now a5, freezing the queen side. I wasn't interested in queen takes rook because with my two bishops and my two pawns, I know this is a very easy thematic win. After rook at a to c1, now d5. On queen c3, offering to trade queens, queen g6. Again, my goal is the white king, so I want to keep my queens, I want to keep the queens on the board, and keep my bishops open and active. After queen e3, now I could win with the thematic d4, queen g3, e5, and just pushing in the center. e4, fe, rook takes, queen takes. I now have the beautiful diagonal. And after rook e1, the plan here would be queen c6 with the idea of rook d6, rook f6, cutting off the f file, and then queen h1 mate. That would be one very thematic way to go. However, I also calculated that by opening the file and rook d3, I would win the very valuable h3 pawn. Valuable not so much in the terms of it's valuable in and of itself, but rather in terms of getting closer to the white king. After queen e2, rook takes h3. Note that also bishop d4 pinning the f pawn was strong. After bishop e3, queen e4 is very powerful. But going back to the game, after queen e2, I went ahead and snipped the pawn. After f3, now h5, time to open the h-file. White went bonkers here with f4, and the game ended very quickly. After bishop d4, king f1, h takes g4, the threat is simply g3. After knight g4, rook h1, mate. Here we see, of course, the power of the hippopotamus bishop combined with the power of our g6 dark squared bishop. Again, not a perfect game. Some instructive points. I should have played h6 earlier. Maybe I should have played b5 earlier. But it shows the flexibility that the hippo has.